Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the north in the direction of Kislivka, where the Russians have advanced further within the village of Kislivka, focusing on it first before moving on to Kostyantynivka in the south. With the fighting taking place, we see the Russians have now gained control over the central parts of the village and will move into the western parts of it in the coming days, where the Russians look to gain control of it and take control over the fortifications to the west of it to cut off the supplies to Kostyantynivka and taking control of that as well. This will force a Ukrainian withdrawal from Kostyantynivka or cut them off. Moving further south, we see here in the direction of the east of Yampolivka, the Russians have yet again been pushed back by the Ukrainian advances here in the area. The Ukrainians have made 3 advances so far. The first one to capture the northern parts of the forest patch, second one to push them out of it, and with the third one, the Ukrainians have managed to regain some of these forest lines and are continuously pushing the Russians back. It seems that the Russians had either made a withdrawal in this section of the front line or the Ukrainians simply launched an offensive here to free up this area from Russian pressure and allow the Ukrainians to focus on other sections of the front line like Kislivka in the north. Or maybe the Russians simply focused on Kislivka in the north, leaving this area unattended. East of Jesov, there is this Russian advance here, which allowed the Russians to gain a foothold here by the crossing over the Canal line. According to footage of fighting taking place in the area, the Russians have managed to push through the final parts of the forest patch and move through to the canal crossing. In the northern parts, fighting is taking place continuously within the forest area. The Russian arrival by the crossing itself is a significant development. If the Russians continuously push and gain full control over the forest patch to secure the crossing here in the south of Jesov, it is likely that the Russians will start the offensive operations across the canal line. At the same time, with this, the Russians have successfully cut off the northern and southern parts, which will allow the Russians to focus on either side right now, either to focus on the northern parts here by Kalininia, or simply make a strong push in the south to redirect Ukrainian forces and allow them to then gain control over the northern parts. The arrival of Russian troops by the canal allows them to gain multiple options for what to do next, as the situation has changed in their favor. In the next section of the front line near Ocheretyne, the Russians have managed to advance in every direction. In the north of Novokalinova, the Russians have fully captured Keramik and moved further northwards, where they have captured this fortification east of Archangelsk. It is clear that the Russians are now moving in the direction of Archangelsk. At the same time, there's been this small advance south of the Ukrainian fortifications west of Novokalinova, east of Ocheretyne. This is an attempt to storm the fortifications and push the Ukrainians out, as the Russians are pushing towards Archangelsk, or it could be to hold down and prevent a Ukrainian withdrawal from it, for the Russians to subsequently cut off the supplies to the north of it. So we're seeing heavy fighting here by the Novokalinova direction. In the northwest of Ocheretyne, the Russians are advancing in the direction of Ocheretyne by advancing in the northern direction, capturing the fortifications of the Ukrainians east of Ocheretyne. With the capture of both of these fortifications, the Russians will then move on to Ocheretyne with a direct connection between the Russian and Ukrainian positions in the area. It could also be delayed until fighting over Archangelsk is done. However, it is unlikely, as the Russians want to make use of their momentum that they have built up in this section of the front line. In the south by Solevyove, the Russians have advanced further westwards, taking a foothold within the Ukrainian fortifications there and capturing a forest line here to the south. This is an advance towards Novopokrovsk as well as in the direction of Sukil. It is clear that the Russians want to expand their zone of control west of Solevyove and Novokalinova in the direction of the next line of defense of the Ukrainian armed forces. We're seeing that the target here by the Russians are in several directions. There is the one that I've been talking about, with the Russians looking to gain control of this area here west of Avdiivka, create a buffer zone and a springboard for an offensive towards Pokrovsk. But it seems that the Russian priority right now is in a northern direction. I mentioned in an analysis that the Russians would likely launch an offensive towards Kostyantynivka from both the south and the east. From the south, the Russians would look to gain control over Avdiivka, push in a northern direction towards Kostyantynivka and flank it from the west, and in the east they would gain control over Chasiv Yar and push towards Kostyantynivka. The Russians are currently fighting over Chasiv Yar and have captured Avdiivka. Since then, they moved in a northwestern direction in a spearhead that spans about 24 kilometers from the fortifications here north of Donetsk, the 2014 line of contact, all the way towards the Ocheretyne. This is approximately 27 kilometers from Pokrovsk, so they have captured about half of the distance between Avdiivka and Pokrovsk in an indirect direction. This is through the road going through from Avdiivka all the way through Ocheretyne and towards Pokrovsk. However, what we do see is that the Russians are focusing in a northern direction, and they're not limiting it to a direct strike from Avdiivka to Kostyantynivka, but are instead expanding in a northwestern direction. It is likely based on this that the Russians will look to cut off the highway between Kostyantynivka and Pokrovsk here by the intersection northwest of Ocheretyne. This will allow the Russians to push through the roads and look to gain full control over the whole area southwest of Kostyantynivka by gaining control over the highway from Avdiivka as well as the highway from Pokrovsk. This would be an assault by the Russians where they will look to expand their zone of control here west of Ocheretyne by the buffer zone that I mentioned previously, and in a northwestern direction from Ocheretyne towards the highway, and then moving from that highway direction towards Kostyantynivka through that highway and the surrounding villages, gaining control over them as well. At the same time pushing northwards from Novokalinove and through the highway, capturing the Ukrainian fortifications in the area, moving further northwards towards Kostyantynivka. This will allow the Russians to attack Kostyantynivka, which is in itself located in a valley, which means that either side would be the high ground, whether it is the south or the north by Chasiv Yar or Avdiivka. In both cases, the Russians would be attacking Kostyantynivka from the high ground, as we see with the topographic map here. Chasiv Yar is located on the high grounds with an elevation of about 250 meters. Kostyantynivka itself is located at about 85 meters, and to the south by the highway there are locations at about 200 meters. At closer you get, the lower you go. So the Russians would be attacking Kostyantynivka from the high grounds, both from the east and from the south, which would give them a significant advantage geographically. This analysis was also well explained by Syriac maps. We see both of these pictures here. The first one shows the initial advances that the Russians would be looked to gain by pushing the Ukrainians back to a next line of defense and gaining control over the area west of Ocheretyne and towards the intersection by the highway and in the northern direction from Ocheretyne and Novokalinove. The second part is this one here, where we see that the Russians would then push in a northern direction towards Kostyantynivka, both through the highway to the east and the highway to the west. So with this, it is clear that the primary target of the Russians is not Pokrovsk, but instead Kostyantynivka. This will all be in combination with the assault on Chasiv Yar, where the Russians would look to push through there as well. With that, we see that it is clear that the Russians will be focusing on the capture of the Donbass region to the Donetsk region, rather than a larger offensive, in this case isolated. And in regards to this, there is this article by the Wall Street Journal, Russia seizes villages, exploiting advantage gained from Ukraine's long wait for Western aid. In the article, they discuss how the Russian advances and successes threaten Ukraine with the collapse of the front. The advance of the Russian army in the Donbass revealed the vulnerability of the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces. Moreover, according to analysts, there is a possibility that with further pressure from the Russian armed forces, the Ukrainian front will collapse. So based on this analysis, it is now clear that the Russians will be moving towards Kostyantynivka both from the south and from the east, while at the same time the Russians are focusing in an offensive towards Kupiansk in the north. There is some Ukrainian pressure in the Kreminna section of the front line, where the Russians have already created this buffer zone, so there's no major threat to Russian positions within the area. In the Siversk direction, it is fairly silent. Same with the Ocheretyne direction. This could change with the Russian advances north of Kostyantynivka. It could be an attempt to bypass the Ukrainian fortifications by Donetsk and New York, or it could be an opportunity where the Russians will look to push the Ukrainians out or capture these cities and heavily fortified areas. We see that after the initial defensive lines, the Russians would be able to break through those and be left in an area that is a large open field before the next defensive positions, which are much weaker and scarce than what they are to the south. If the Russians do gain control of those, there would be a vast free area west of Kostyantynivka and Ruskivka that is completely undefended. And if they manage to break through the next line of defense, there is no Ukrainian defensive line, there's no fortifications. On all of these fortifications in the direction of Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk, and all of the other areas here to the west are also fairly newly built, making them weaker than the older fortifications near the eastern parts of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, here in the area in between Bakhmut and those cities. So we see that there are areas where heavy fortifications and heavy density of Ukrainian troops are available, and other areas where the Ukrainians would be left largely unattended. A good reason for Pokrovsk being a massive target in this section is that it is a supply hub for the Ukrainians in the Donetsk region, and it is also in an area in which, if the Russians gain control of it and the surrounding fortifications, they'll be able to push in a northern direction, which is largely unattended by the Ukrainian armed forces, and flank the Ukrainian positions by Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. This means if the Russians do use enough troops in the section of the front line, they may even attempt to attack both Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka at the same time, rather than prioritizing one over the other. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content for paid subscription. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.